This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't out-train her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Ready to pop the question? The jewelers at BlueNile.com have got sparkle down to a science with beautiful lab-grown diamonds worthy of your most brilliant moments. Their lab-grown diamonds are independently graded and guaranteed identical to natural diamonds, and they're ready to ship to your door. Go to BlueNile.com and use promo code LISTEN to get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. That's code LISTEN at BlueNile.com for $50 off. BlueNile.com, code LISTEN.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name's John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Matthew Page about his new book, 100 Bible Films, which is coming out via the BFI later this month. We should perhaps have had this conversation at Easter, considering its religious overtones, but I think you'll find this is a real eye-opener because biblical movies have been hugely important and popular, and they've also been at the forefront of technical changes. The first widescreen film ever was The Robe, for instance, and now even the world of VR is becoming a space where biblical religious-themed movies are taking place. Anyway, I'm going to let Matthew talk about that because he's the expert. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and spread the word generally. You can follow me on Twitter at Drjonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation. One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was I'm fascinated by the Bible, and yet as a sort of genre, Bible films, despite being enormously popular and enormously important, seem to kind of be sort of ignored. Do you think that's correct?
I do think it is, actually. Yeah, I think it's I mean the classic example of that is the Mel Gibson film, which he took it around all the studios, and none of them would touch it, and you can kind of understand why, because it was in a couple of dead languages and extremely violent. But it was interesting how wrong all those studios were ultimately proved. So yeah, it is very interesting from that. And I think there's particularly within kind of film circles, but partly because of the biblical epics have come to almost represent the whole, any approach to the Bible. People just think of those, and because they are, now seen as kind of very camp and their weaknesses are more apparent, I think people tend to kind of leave the whole thing alone a bit, and perhaps reflecting also perhaps a bit more ambiguity about religion in general in society, and particularly the bits of society that tend to be more into kind of like hardcore cinephiles like ourselves.
How did you come about this sort of particular project? What was your sort of fascination?
Well, it goes back about 20 years. So at the time, I was involved with a church that was trying to make kind of church, Christianity, etc., quite more relevant, and particularly relevant to younger people. And it just seemed to me like this was a good way to kind of, people aren't reading so much anymore. Probably there's going to be emphasis more towards visual, which 20 years ago was not as apparent as it is now. Things like YouTube had yet to be born. But that just seemed to me that was the direction of travel, really. So I set about trying to find a version that I thought would do that well. And so I knew the kind of some of the Jesus films I was familiar with as a child, so things like Jesus of Nazareth, and this other film called the Jesus film, and I didn't really like them. And so I was trying to find something, I guess, that matched the image in my head. But then I quite quickly began to realize what a very kind of limited way to approach the whole thing that was, and almost kind of the opposite of the best way to approach it, really.
So from there, what films did you sort of pick out that you could use to engage young people in your church?
Well, I think it was quite a while before Refinement. So I started working through. I mean, this was the kind of days when even Amazon was not a known quantity, really. They were kind of around, and there were a couple of other companies that were doing the same thing, and they were a great advantage because you couldn't kind of pop into HMV in those days and pick up even something as popular as The King of Kings. So I kind of worked my way through kind of some of the classics quite quickly, and then then I managed to get hold of a kind of TV film that was made in 1999 called Jesus, and there was a whole kind of series of biblical adaptations made by a Italian company actually called Lux Vitae, who kind of partnered with a whole bunch of TV networks across Europe to bring these things, and they had one, and that kind of, at the time, that worked for me, although I now kind of look back and cringe slightly at that, because that isn't one of my, I kind of see a lot of faults with both that portrayal and that film, but yeah, I think it kind of worked on that level. But there was also this Christian writer at the time called Philip Yancey, who described about what he quite often used to do is, if they were looking at a particular story, he would take clips from 5 or 6 different films and show them all, and that would enable them to kind of have a discussion. And it was interesting to see the stuff that came out of that. So I did that a few times, and it is always a really fascinating task, because you kind of realize in doing that just how individually people see things, how individually you see things yourself, and how you make kind of certain assumptions that you think, well, this is, this, you think you kind of got it in your head how it happens, and then someone comes out with a completely different interpretation looking at the same basic text. And so I did, I started doing that a bit more, and so almost that kind of multiplicity of different approaches is a really interesting way to kind of come back and expose, I suppose, some of our own cultural biases or our blind spots, or the things we bring to reading the text that we don't necessarily realize.
It's so interesting looking through your book, reading your book, and reading the absolute breadth of cinema involved. I mean, that's where I think it was kind of a revelation reading your book and thinking, wow, what other genre has such disparate talents as John Huston and Jean-Luc Godard and, Alex Serra and Harold Ramis and, John Stevens and William Wyler. It's just got a massive breadth of innovation and talent and all the rest of it that goes much further than the sort of, as you say, the sort of Cecil B. DeMille stereotypical epic, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's really interesting for me that some of the kind of the greatest, most revered filmmakers have all kind of come back to this topic, and I suppose in some ways we perhaps shouldn't be surprised by that, because that's been true of history and other art forms as well. You only have to, for example, in painting, but again, people forget about it, and as you say, it's kind of a looked down on era of film, but it has this terrific pedigree. Rossellini obviously did a few as well, and
Pasolini's probably one of my favorites.
Yeah, well, same here as well. So yeah, and also, as well as that kind of like those kind of revered Western filmmakers, there's also just this thing of it touching so many different movements, globally. So, I think there's one of the films in the book that was a kind of 1980s Indonesian film that was, on the one hand, it was kind of an extension of the kind of Italian peplum. It was called Samson and Delilah, but it was this it kind of moved from that into a slightly kind of horror genre almost. It was kind of like on the way, and so yeah. But it was, and I'd never watched an Indonesian film before, and I knew nothing about kind of this director and the star Susanna, who's the kind of queen of Indonesian horror, and I think I found myself thinking, what other project would have brought me to here? It's kind of, and it's just it's so interesting that you can kind of one day you can be looking at something like that, and the next day you can be looking at a kind of Bollywood style film from India, and then looking at something completely at the other end of the scale as well. And it really is. I think what's good about the subject is it forces you, if you kind of really take it on, it forces you to look into areas of film that you would never have wandered into previously, because it is so widespread, and those stories are so well known in so many cultures, and also kind of historically as well have been were popular 125 years ago as they are today.
Yeah. I mean, let's go back to 125 years ago and the sort of like the birth of cinema. I seem to remember I was researching an article once, and it was something like the first fictional portrayals or the first cinematic portrayals of famous people in film. I think it's Santa Claus, Dracula, and Jesus. It sort of goes in, which kind of
the hierarchy.
Exactly, it tells you everything you need to know about cinema, basically.
Yeah.
But you say you're Bible films are right at the very beginning of cinema, and they're also kind of almost immediately really, really popular, and it's that. I mean, it's, again, if you want to go with a stereotyped view of religion, it would be that idea that religion is always very conservative and very resistant to change. But it's also it's also frequently at the forefront of technological innovation. Yeah,
and very much with the biblical films. I think, one of the films I've not been able to cover in the book because it's not really properly in existence, but it's Méliès's Jesus Walking on the Water, and that was that was an opportunity for Méliès, who was kind of coming from that kind of magician special effects angle, and started to really showcase some of those things and bringing that in, because here is a text that has gives you the opportunity to bring these things in. And I think that was undoubtedly a draw for some of the earliest filmmakers. Was here we can do things like make angels appear that you can't do on a painting, or it's a chance to kind of showcase these techniques. And so it was, and you kind of see that kind of spectacular wing of the movement developing on and on. It kind of starts off with simple double exposures, and that kind of then builds into the more kind of Demille-esque silence with the parting of the Red Seas, and then on to the later epics in the 50s and 60s that are also doing using the special effects there through to some of the CGI stuff that you see in Aronofsky's films and onwards, really. And even actually, and I know you're based in Italy, so there are a couple of films in the last decade in Italy that have kind of been feature-length VR films, and again about Jesus. And so you can kind of put on a headset and you can kind of, they're not hugely sophisticated, but you can put on the headset and you can kind of be at the edge of the Sermon on the Mount or whatever and have a look around and see. You can almost have that view. You can look at Jesus, or you can look at the people squabbling about cheesemakers on the right, and it has that whole experience. And so it has been very much on that kind of progressive wing of technology. And I think partly that's also tied into commercially the fact that they've all, certainly at the earliest days, they were kind of a bit of a banker because there was a ready audience for it. I mean, it's these days we have kind of, we if you slap the name Spider-Man or Batman on a film, you've instantly got a kind of audience that is going to turn up regardless of what the reviews say. And it's a little bit that same thing, only in the in the 1890s and the early 1900s, that this is known material,
brand recognition. It's brand recognition.
It is, it is, and it's
Samson and Delilah. I know who Samson and Delilah are. I know this story.
Yeah,
show me it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and these were the popular stories in the 19th century, and there was as well as we kind of tend to think, I suppose, of painting and that kind of thing, but there was quite a lot of more popularist movements going on around that time. So you've got the kind of the depictions of Tissot and Doré in their kind of doing a whole stack of biblical scenes, but you've also got movements in kind of opera and plays, and the kind of popularized novels. Things like Ben-Hur was one of a number of kind of novels based around the Jesus story, and quite soon a lot of those start to then get adapted as films from very early on.
Yeah, and of course you would have had sort of like village-based passion plays and stuff like that.
Exactly,
written into the culture, and people going to church, or temple,
getting every week.
Yeah, exactly. See it on Saturday night and then hear about it on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
I mean, so we go, as you mentioned, we sort of have these big silence with D.W. Griffith's sort of. I love your description of intolerance as this sort of, basically a pre-culture war sort of cancel culture complaint about so I'm racist, am I? Well, maybe the real racists are you for thinking I'm racist.
Yeah, well, it's interesting with that film, because I think when I first started looking into this, there was this view out there that intolerance was kind of this apology for Birth of a Nation, and it was kind of this, I've overstepped the mark there and been a bit racist, and so maybe I need to do a film about how intolerance is bad, and that never quite sat right with me. It never, I couldn't quite put my finger on why it didn't work for me, and then Donald Trump comes along. And this whole, it's not just him as well, I suppose, the kind of other figures, perhaps closer to home, that started using this. Well, if you're telling me I can't say that about, migrants, and you're calling me racist, well, you're the intolerant ones. And then it just kind of clicked. Oh yeah, actually what's gone on with this film is that he's not arguing that, racism is bad. He's kind of gone and churned up a load more of it in this film. He's actually trying to say, look at this cancel culture in the words of days.
They crucified Jesus. They cancelled Jesus, man.
Basically, people like you. It's people like you calling me racist that crucified Jesus. Is this essence of that film, which is which is why it's not one of the ones I'm keenest on in the book, despite some of its strengths. But
yeah, he's a sort of Leni Riefenstahl, isn't he? You sort of look at it and you go, okay, yeah, technically good, but I don't know how many more stormtroopers I need to see.
Yeah.
It reminds
No, sorry. Well, as well, he was, a lot of the stuff he was drawing on was stuff that was coming out of Italy at the time, and so, they had Quo Vadis in 1912, which again was one of these Victorian era novels that had been adapted, and Calibri. I always get the pronunciation of that one wrong because I always Cabiria. Yes, sorry. I always get confused between Caligari the place and Knights of Cabiria, the film. And somehow in my head I never say it properly. But that film was a film that Griffiths had seen and drew on widely, and actually those kind of two Italian epics were the films that really broke a lot of that ground in terms of the kind of spectacular the spectacular sets and the kind of the crowd of thousands that later became a defining hallmark of the epics. But he's often credited with that kind of thing, which is he kind of assembled a lot of neat tricks that others have kind of pioneered. But
one of those early filmmakers who I mean, as with many books I'm reading for this podcast, it keeps inspiring me to put more films on my watch list, my ever-growing watch list. And some of the films I put on were, as a result of reading your book, were the Michael Curtiz films that I've not seen, the Noah's Ark, and did he do a Samson and Delilah or Sodom and Gomorrah?
I did Sodom and Gomorrah, yeah.
Right. I knew it was something and something.
Yeah, he was involved in It was kind of involved in a Samson and Delilah as well, but it's not quite clear how much he was. That was the same year as Sodom and Gomorrah, and another film that was called The Moon of Israel, which was a kind of Moses type film. But yeah, in those days, him and DeMille seemed to have this kind of respectful rivalry going on between the two of them, and they were kind of aware of each other's projects and would maybe shift their films in a different way. But yeah, he was probably at the end of the 20s was probably better known for his biblical epics than DeMille was, really. DeMille had kind of done 50 odd films, and only 2 of them had been biblical epics, whereas Curtiz had done 3 or 4, as I say. And yeah, some of those films, they kind of take a similar approach to Intolerance in terms of adapting that different eras of time history and commenting on one of the others. And the Sodom Gomorrah film is kind of really interesting because in one of the cuts, it kind of has this ever decreasing circles thing that it kind of you go in several layers at a time, or I suppose almost like a kind of I forgot what's the name of the Nolan film?
Inception.
Yes, Inception. Yeah, my head was just going Intolerance.
I was thinking Intercession for some reason because we're talking about the Bible. But fortunately, there was a divine intercession, and I remembered the name Inception.
Yeah. So it has this kind of plot structure where you start off with this kind of 1920s womanist party, and then she has a dream about events happening at the same party, and then within that dream, the character starts telling the story of Noah's Ark, and then even within that, it then kind of leaps back into this kind of Assyrian events happening in Assyria as well. So it's quite a kind of complex plot for. Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose we say complex plot for 1920s. We forget that they often, the plotting was quite complex by then already. But yeah, it's interesting that something like that is still being done and considered novel, 80 years later or 90 years later. But
yeah, where it all started back there. Yeah, absolutely. Which of those films would you recommend then? Because if I mean, I'm
the Curtiz ones.
Yeah. Which do you think are the most?
They're all they all have their strengths and their weaknesses, really. I mean, I think the kind of set design on them is pretty magnificent and out there. They do drag a little bit in some ways. I think the 2 I do in the book are Sodom and Gomorrah and Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark is interesting on top of the kind of the biblical material that's in there, because it's one of those films in that transition from talking pictures from silence to talkies, and so so most of it is silent, but you get these kind of few bits of early text put in there. And I always find those films interesting because of the way because it kind of works. You think it wouldn't really work and it would sound quite awkward, but it does kind of work. And it's also interesting because it draws in. I mean, Curtiz basically decides to sling as many different kind of random bits of the Bible in there as possible. So he's technically it's about Noah's Ark, but it ends up being this scene where he's kind of on a mountain on his knees with this book that looks like the the tablets of the Ten Commandments on flaming words before him, and it's telling him to build this ark, and it's just really reminiscent of Moses. And there's quite there's kind of Christ figures in there. It's kind of a whole jumble of things going in there, but particularly the flood scenes in that are pretty spectacular. And I think I mean, it's one of those stories where extras did actually lose their lives on the set of that film. But yeah, so I think those are the 2 to. Sorry, go on.
No, I was there was one that was shot in Italy that you mentioned as well, that the Italian extras couldn't swim, and basically.
Yeah, I think that might have been the first Ben Hur.
Yeah, it was because they do the sea battle with like real sized ships out in the bay, and basically the extras who are very poor and need the work, but aren't able to swim. So you kind of go along with it. You can see how that would unwind, that someone turns up and they think they're just doing this, and then they get asked to do this, and they just how desperate for the money. That idea of making sort of the contradictions of the process and the sort of moral regard in which the text is held.
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of moral regard, I mean, it doesn't take too long before anti-Semitism comes into the discussion of you bring it up with, I've forgotten the title, but you bring it up with an early-ish German
Der Galilea.
film.
Yeah, Der Galilea.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty horrific in some ways. I think. It's one of these things that it is. I mean, we forget, I think, that the Holocaust seems so far ago to some of us now. But we forget that actually that was an event that happened in about a third of the way into cinema history. It was an event that happened after films like The Adventures of Robin Hood, after Casablanca, after the start of film noir, and all these films had all happened and gone before that event had even happened. So it's actually a very recent event, and yet we kind of forget it, and it could never happen again way. And I think, and also as a result, I think a lot of Christians are quite unaware of how complicit Christianity has been in that. I think most Christians today would talk about God as being a God of love, and Jesus being the kind of embodiment of that. And they don't, and so because of that, anti-Semitism, or the idea of what happened at the Holocaust, seems as abhorrent to them as it does to the rest of us. But it was a very, but essentially those things were kind of fed and watered throughout church history, and it has kind of come down to kind of Christian traditions, and often these passion plays, in parts of Europe and particularly Russia, for example, often there would be this tradition of you do your passion play at Easter, and then you go out and you lynch some Jews because they're the Christ killers, and they were seen as different stratas of kind of who the most valuable races of humans are. This was hearing something the other day that was saying about this, and although the kind of order of some of those nations varies on the charts, in terms of like kind of Western Europeans, they always kind of had the Jewish people at the bottom. And so so this was the kind of the context going into the start of the 20th century. And we forget as well. Sorry, I keep saying we. You're obviously in Italy these days, but in this, in England, we kind of forget that we were against the Nazis in World War II, but in terms of our own anti-Semitism, there were 500 years where Jewish people were just banned from the country. Half a millennium, and so what you see then coming out after the World War, obviously there's this period of anti-Semitism growing, and people being persuaded that the reason for their problems was because of the Jewish people and Hitler's whole argument. And so you start, and when you start to see in that light some of the kind of stereotypes that are emerged in that play, it is quite chilling. I think I guess when I was younger and I was kind of growing up in churches, people quite often said when they thought about Jesus, it was Robert Powell's face they saw, and this was the kind of that was the kind of, because they knew Jesus of Nazareth, and that was how it was. And it got me thinking about that whole thing of well, in Germany in the kind of 20s and 30s, what was that image for them? Well, there was a reasonable chance that for some of them it would have been, their images would have been formed by this Jesus film. And of course, when you see this Jesus film, you see you see the Jewish characters portrayed very negatively. They have these kind of hats, which are kind of technically a kind of a traditional type priest's hat, but they also look like horns. They're kind of this kind of big pointy horns type thing. But also just this thing that, this crowd is incredibly fickle and turns to violence when when it looks like Jesus isn't going to get condemned and all this kind of stuff. And and when you start to think about how people in later decades in Germany leading up to the Holocaust, how they envisage Jesus, it's both kind of a testament to what they think, but it's potentially something that shaped people's thoughts as well. And had a role. So it's both kind of reflective and possibly building on that, and the kind of whatever happened in the minds of that culture. So yeah, it was quite shocking to me when I first watched it and put some of those connections together.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating as well that you take this sort of cinematic tradition and you don't I mean, as we both have passion for cinema, obviously, you don't want to think of the thing you have a passion for being sort of the appetizer to a pogrom, and that's kind of that's I guess as well, this kind of film, because it deals with ethics, it's kind of easy for a film to be unethical because it is insisting on an ethical framework for the universe. It's an ethical framework for everything. So I'm quite happy to watch sort of a Western and think, well, it glorifies violence, but it's a Western, I don't care. But a religious film which sort of glorifies, as anti-Semitism or some form of the universe that I don't agree with, it's much more difficult to sort of dismiss because it's in the DNA of the film.
Yeah, and I think this is what makes it interesting in the modern day, is that we have, I mean, again, in the UK, this isn't such an issue, but in America, obviously, you have this growing movement within the kind of alignment of right-wing politics and evangelical Christianity, to the extent that a significant proportion of those people that were pro the storming of the Capitol and would still vote for Trump and believe the election was stolen. Increasing that group is starting to look like a kind of a Christian demographic, and those, and often they're from quite large, wealthy, powerful churches, and a lot of those churches are now starting to make their own films and make their own versions of Jesus, and have been doing and promoting their own view of things. I mean, this was where Mel Gibson made his money, was off the back of those kind of churches, and that sense of that is inherent throughout the whole of Trumpism, that America has been dumbed down, and traditional right-wing values are kind of being silenced, and people that hold to those things are being persecuted. It's that whole thing was expressed, I think, in the readiness which people took on Gibson's films. And so I think as they're starting to make these productions, it is it's a concern for me, I suppose, that what are the messages of these films and what are they doing?
It's interesting as well.
Where is that going to lead?
Oh, absolutely, and that idea that they're doing things like that they book their own cinema, and it gives a new model of distribution as well, which is is fascinating. I mean, to just stay on the Gibson film for a moment, obviously, the anti-Semitism that we talk about in the 1930s, 20s is absolutely. I mean, that film's virulently anti-Semitic, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think there's a lot you can kind of say, certain ways you can kind of mitigate some of the things, but in terms of what Gibson's intention maybe was, I don't think he deliberately set out to make an anti-Semitic film, but I also think he utterly failed to silence those tendencies when they were pointed out to him and they emerged. And I think, I mean, what you have to remember about him is his his dad was a Holocaust. He's a Holocaust denier, or was a Holocaust denier, which is pretty high on the scale of anti-Semitism. And if you were growing up in that atmosphere, how that would undoubtedly affect your thoughts, even as an adult, as to how you see some of those things. And so I don't think he sat down and thought, right, I'm gonna get the Jews in this film. I don't think that was his intention. But I think some of those elements, undoubtedly leaked through. His source material was already anti-Semitic, and just the ways he depicts things, the stuff that's between the text and the image on the screen, I think particularly is there. And particularly, for example, the way that kind of Pontius Pilate is this kind of noble philosopher kind of figure in the film, and he's kind of wandering around his apartment, and it's kind of full of it feels a little bit like a kind of first century IKEA, and there's floating white sheets that are fluttering in the breeze, and he's there going, oh, should I kill Jesus? Should I either? On the other hand, you've got this kind of Caiaphas, who's portrayed as the Jewish leader, who seems to hold more influence over Pilate, than he would be in any way historically likely. And he is in this kind of this version of Jabba's lair, almost from Return of the Jedi. Yeah, and I kind of made this point years ago, and a couple of other people have picked it up independently, I think, of just some of the similarities in terms of the kind of the way the scene's lit and the way it's constructed, and the kind of costumes of some of the guards. And this, it's this kind of underground lair where they're all kind of plotting to get Jesus and have this trial. And he's this kind of, he's not a attractive man. He's kind of slightly overweight. He has bad teeth, and he's got all huge amounts of bling on. And it's and all of that is interpretation that would as I say, it wasn't set around deliberately to cause those things, but it completely completely staggers those two characters against each other, and kind of implicates the Jews in things far more than would have been historically likely. And I think then the biggest problem with Gibson's film, I think where it gets beyond that realm of, well, this was in there and it came out unbeknown to him, was that when people started pointing out to him their concerns about it, particularly the Anti-Defamation League, the kind of the Jewish organization to kind of counter anti-Semitism, when they started pointing out some of these things, instead of saying, oh, that's quite worrying, I wouldn't want to do that, and maybe I need to make some changes, and can you advise me on those changes? What he actually did was he then kind of leveraged that into a publicity campaign and made it about, these people aren't wanting to get these films.
They tried to crucify Jesus as well.
Well, yeah. I mean,
we're back there, aren't we?
It was a real persecution narrative, and it became a kind of, there was this kind of badge of honor that if you support this film, you're supporting the gospel, and otherwise you're against these kind of, it's the studios, which obviously there's even a connotation with that of kind of Jewishness. But particularly the way that whole thing was orchestrated against these people doing it. I mean, there was one of the lines. There's one of the lines that's always controversial is the bit in Matthew's gospel where the Jewish people say, "His blood be on us and our people," which is a verse that has been used historically to justify anti-Semitism and acts of violence against Jewish people, because, well, your ancestors back in 33 AD said this, so and he was kind of told that you should really need to take that out, and eventually he left it in the Aramaic but didn't subtitle it, which is could certainly have been better. But he also said about that line, he said, he kind of went on the record and said, if I'd have taken that out, if I'd left that in there, they'd have been coming after me. And this, this idea that, they'd have been attacking it. I can't quite remember the exact phrasing, but they'd have been attacking his house, as if, and yeah, I mean, and that just, to me, that just felt that, this moves us beyond the kind of, well, maybe this wasn't his intention, but he's been very careless with it, and he's obviously got stuff to deal with, to this level of actually he's been told about this, and his response has been, rather than to listen and to make changes, he's gone out and he's used it to make himself millions of dollars.
Yeah, no, I think I'm a little bit more cynical in regard to Mr. Gibson. I think that he fully intended to be anti-Semitic. I mean, he's
really.
Well, I mean, in terms of his father, he was pushed repeatedly to. I mean, his father is this sort of hardcore, far-right Catholic who wrote a book called "Is the Pope Catholic?" about John Paul II, basically saying he's not Catholic because he's nowhere near right-wing enough, he's nowhere near traditional enough. And when he was asked about it in interviews, Gibson said, "My father has never said an untrue word in his life." You know, when specifically asked about the Holocaust denial, he said, "My father's never lied to me. He's never said an untrue word." According to Joe Esterhaus and several other, Winona Ryder, I think, as well, he refers frequently to Jewish friends and colleagues as oven dodgers. So I just don't. I mean, and you've got Satan in that movie, sort of manifesting itself in sort of Jewish children. You know? I mean, it just
and those are particularly problematic. Those scenes where. Yeah, as you say, you know, these Jewish children who, you know, are wearing yarmulkes and, you know, basically become demons, and they, and again, you know, the children of the Jews is another just stereotype. It, I mean, I think I have a window in terms of which I see it, of which I see a window of possibility, and I think the kind of the most, I suppose, what I was saying before is probably the most leeway I'd be prepared to give him on it. But at the same time, there are a lot of, as you say, there are a lot of other troubling stories, and there's I think as you say, the Winona Ryder quotes and just fit in with this bigger narrative. And I don't recall the quote about the father never having said a true word. That's pretty damning.
I met him once, Gibson, and he's a very very, very strange character. He's extremely fidgety and nervous and very really uncomfortable with journalists for perhaps obvious reasons. But he was what was the film? It was the war film he was promoting. The
Hacksaw Ridge.
Is it Hacksaw Ridge? Is that the one? The one with Andrew Garfield?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Sort of to round off this the passion, our passionate passion discussion.
Yeah.
I really liked the movie. I mean, I went to the cinema to see it. As you imagine, in Italy, it was very uncritically. Well, no, that's not fair. But it was hugely popular, and cinemas were full. I mean, cinemas were Avengers full. Oh yeah, I mean, like it became. There is a cinema going tradition in Italy.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
Need a holiday gift that will keep her sparkling all year long? Blue Nile, the original online jeweler, has experts on hand 24/7 who can help you find the perfect piece. Beyond that, Blue Nile makes the gifting experience easier than ever with guaranteed free shipping and returns, as well as a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Right now, get 30% off jewelry at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com for 30% off. BlueNile.com.
And everything, but there are also frequent moments where everybody who doesn't go to the cinema goes to the cinema. So Christmas is traditionally that. People who only go to the cinema once a year go at Christmas, and the Mel Gibson film became that thing, and it was highly effective as a, Mark Kermode and Quentin Tarantino, among others, described it as a horror movie, and it kind of works as that sort of hostile style torture porn as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you were saying that I was listening to some of the podcast. I think it was with Kim Newman you did the other day, and saying about how the kind of the rise of kind of the torture porn films at the same time, the kind of Saw franchise and so on, and it does fit into that angle of that kind of niche of horror cinema. And a lot of the kind of a lot of the tropes right from the start, there's this kind of like blue filter on that opening scene in the Gethsemane, and it is very effective. And I do remember really being wowed by those opening scenes and about how they kind of really brought something else that none of the other Jesus films had brought at that stage. So there are bits of it that are incredibly well done, and are very powerful. And it's not it's not surprising in some ways that so many kind of parts of the church were so taken with it, because it was it was very effectively done. Plus you've got the kind of Gibson star status at the time as well, and a lot of people are looking forward to still kind of talk about a sequel and a kind of Passion of the Christ 2, or not the one from the Family Guy, or the kind of around the resurrection, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for that.
I mean, well, let's sort of, as a corrective, let's talk about sort of the way the Bible has also been used from another sort of political side. In the sense of using it as a sort of liberation theology and in films. I mean, I was taken with your description of the film Green Pastures, where you have what 50, 60, 70 years before Morgan Freeman plays God, you have a black version of God.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting film, and it's not without its question marks from a racial angle, but it is. Certainly at the time, it was very progressive. This was not that long from after the kind of end of slavery in America, and it was certainly 30 years before that, or 25, 30 years before the kind of civil rights movement in the 60s, and you have this whole all black cast playing all the characters, and particularly this very very amiable, down-to-earth, relatable God character that is, is shown as God and is shown as the creator, and kind of has these kind of interactions with the people as well. So that that was a big step forward, and there were at the time a number of these there were kind of quite a lot of kind of early African American cinema was starting to emerge at that time, and some of it made by white producers and maybe white directors, but these were films that brought us and have recorded for posterity some of the work, some of the strong work by early talking era black actors that otherwise we wouldn't have, or we would only see in the kind of stereotypical type roles you get in films like Gone with the Wind and so on. Yeah, and it's a wonderful film. I mean, the soundtrack on it is just fantastic, and it really draws you into the story. But yeah, it's a great movie.
Going straight to the top of my watch list, that film, just on the basis of that description.
Yeah. It's and it's funny as well. It's it isn't a film that is taking itself overly serious, but it's kind of a really interesting balance, because it's quite, I suppose it reflects a kind of relatively stern theology, I suppose you would say, the kind of the idea of God's displeasure at the world around him, and the way that's explained and shown often in a kind of modern way is in the mix. But at the same time, it's playful and it's joyous, and it's slightly tongue-in-cheek, and it isn't taking itself seriously, and it's a very kind of creative approach to the material, because you have these children that are in Sunday school, and kind of their Sunday school teachers telling them about the stories, and they're kind of picturing things in their head at the same time. So yeah, it's one definitely worth checking out, I think.
So as we move through sort of the history, because your book is sort of organised chronologically, so you get a real feel of the sort of how things are developing, how things are coming back. I mean, would you describe that sort of post-war period, which saw, you know, Ben-Hur and Ten Commandments and The Robe, is that kind of the sort of golden age of the biblical epic?
Well, I'd say not quite, actually. I mean, I think there's probably three periods when I think it was really happening on a big scale, and certainly that was one of them. There was a period in the 20s as well, which, I mean, we've already kind of talked about Curtis and DeMille, and the original Ben-Hur as well. So those films were really big then, and kind of, you know, the big films of the time then. Actually, the period around kind of 1908 to 1913, there was something like 90 to 100 biblical films made in those kind of 5 or 6 years. They were all quite short at that stage, but it really was, you know, doing all the different stories. And so that in terms of like the number of films, I think that is the heaviest concentration. But yeah, by the time the kind of 50s and 60s comes along, you get DeMille kicks things off with Samson Delilah, and that does kind of massive business and basically reinvents the genre. I mean, obviously you've kind of had the war, and the money that's been available to create these films has been a bit lacking. But from then on, I think for like out of the 11 years that follow then, so 1949 to 1959, biblical epics were the top box office film of the year for either 4 or 5 of them. I think it was 4, and then The Robe was only second in 1953. But you get this. It's a kind of, it's the closest thing, I suppose, there is to what we have in modern day cinema with the Marvel films, and that nowadays we have the biggest grossing films in the box, for the year are dominated by the kind of Marvel comic strip films. And we've never really had another period where that's been so one-sided in terms of a genre. And now we have multiple of those films in the top 10 for any year. But for those periods, it was probably as close as we got to it, because they were coming tops in the box office, and they were proving incredibly popular.
There could be an argument that there's a level of consistency there that is, theologically rather than based on. It's not actually. Iron Man isn't actually based on the Bible, but
no.
But the idea of intercession of higher powers in the affairs of a relatively passive human race that sort of suffers a series of calamities, on an epic scale.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of similarities genre-wise in terms of those two genres, the biblical epics and the comic book films. As you say, you've got these few individuals acting and standing up for what's right and kind of doing the work for you. You've got these kind of miraculous powers that are in the mix and that are kind of really making the difference. You've got the idea of evil and the enemy that's to be opposed. There's a kind of I guess theme through those films about what is and what isn't American values or kind of the right values to live by, that kind of comes through again and again. And and that was a big area of the biblical epics. I mean, a lot of the biblical epics were really about the Cold War. I mean, DeMille, particularly in the Ten Commandments, is kind of forcing that home. And I think and again, you see that in a lot of the in a lot of the Marvel epics. The whole Captain America thing is a classic piece of it's American propaganda. I mean, that has has a very negative connotation, and I don't mean it to be necessarily quite as negative as that, or maybe still a little bit, but it undoubtedly is, because you have this, it's done in this way of, in the 50s they did this kind of thing, it likes to have its cake and eat it, I think, a little bit with how the kind of Captain America's character is seen, because it's kind of seen as a slight relic from the 50s that but we still have him but at the same time, he is also a heroic character played by a heroic-looking, muscular actor who is saving the world, and and a lot of that is done by his kind of skills of collaboration as well as his bravery. But again, it is this thing of largely American-based superheroes, saving the world and fighting these external powers. And there is quite a lot of myth-making going on that are, I suppose, what's the word? Firming up the this idea of kind of American, America as the world's policeman, or America protecting the world from exterior forces that would seek to undo our way of life. So yeah, there are quite a lot of thematic similarities, I think, between the biblical epics and the Marvel stories.
I love the way as well you describe some of those films, and these are films directed by the fantastic filmmakers. I mean, George Stevens directing. There was Nicholas Ray doing King of Kings.
Story. So it was King of Kings with Nicholas Ray with Jeffrey Hunter, and then it was George Stevens was Greatest Story Ever Told with
Max von Sydow. Yeah, and you say how he films it like a western. He basically makes a western out of and that's a really interesting point, I thought. And especially, I've got to tell you that there's this story about John Wayne being the centurion. There's a story that someone told of George Stevens saying, giving direction to John Wayne, and John Wayne delivering the line, "He really was the son of God." And George Stevens apparently said, "Oh, very good, John, but can you give it more awe?" And so John Wayne went, he really was the son of God. I'm sure that's not true, but it's... and then, of course, with the Coen brothers in Hail Caesar, they sort of recreate that scene with George Clooney as a behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, I love Hail Caesar. It was, for quite a while, it was on the list that was going to go in the book, but I kind of eventually took it out reluctantly, but it's it's a great film for people that love biblical epics.
Yeah, films about making films about the Bible. I mean, you mentioned Pasolini's Ricotta as well, which is a really obvious sort of Orson Welles starring. I mean, it's a short film, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting. I mean, this was the film that actually got Pasolini in trouble. Got him, I think it's a suspended prison sentence. It got him to real hot water for blasphemy. And you see it today, and it was so tame. But it's this critique of, you kind of have all these actors that are on this set of a passion play, and and they're all just kind of partying around and dancing and persecuting one of the extras that's playing one of the thieves on the cross, and teasing rather than physically bullying. But and then it's kind of cut in action, and then you see in this kind of almost lurid Technicolor, although kind of I think it's Mannerist style actually. It's there's one painter that's really similar to of the kind of deposition of Jesus being brought off the cross, and it's all these actors you've seen kind of fooling around moments ago, and all this kind of vulgarity going on behind the scenes, producing this kind of supposedly this holy moment. So that's one of those as well. And as you say, there's Hail Caesar, and there's quite a lot of films that are kind of a film about passion plays, where the passion plays within passion plays. So
Jesus of Montreal was one, if I remember right.
Yeah. So that's a really good one, where you kind of have this. They are modern day actors, but they're playing Jesus and the disciples in this passion play, and their lives start to, the character who's playing Jesus, his life starts to dovetail with Jesus's life, and so by the end you can hardly tell them apart. So that's one of those. I mean, Jesus Christ Superstar actually is one of those, the film version, because you have this kind of group of students getting off a bus at the start, and they've got their props coming off. You can see a kind of cross coming off the top of the bus and all this stuff, and then at the end they all get back on the bus, except the actor playing Jesus, who's kind of mysteriously disappeared. But that's one of those. there's at least one other that is He Who Must Die, which was a kind of another film based on a Kazantzakis novel.
Who wrote the novel?
Christ Crucified. Yeah,
Right.
he wrote the novel, and that was adapted by Jules Dassin. And you have a similar thing there of there being this modern day story and this kind of immigration problem, and the characters playing the Jesus and the disciples start to kind of take on their values, to the extent that the kind of the parallel takes over to the point that actually the play never actually happens, because the characters are so radically, this opposition between the authorities and the characters playing the Jesus and the disciples comes to a head before it ever gets there. So that's quite a kind of interesting subgenre, really.
And then, I mean, to talk about sort of generic breadth, I guess, I really appreciated the fact that you put in the comedies. Life of Brian is kind of a very obvious one, and I've always thought Life of Brian got an unfair rap in terms of the blasphemy controversy, because it's definitely irreverent, but comedy. Yeah. Who was it? Chesterton said that comedy is a way of saying serious things in a funny way, and I think that's what Life of Brian does. It's very serious in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, it is very serious behind all the comedy, and I think it's it certainly has its points that it goes for, and it makes them very well. And I mean, there's the classic clip of the show, Friday nights and Saturday morning, with was it Tim Rice hosting a debate between John Cleese and Michael Palin, and on the one hand, and Malcolm Muggeridge and the Bishop of Southwark on the other hand, and in that you can kind of see how very seriously Cleese and Palin are taking it, and the points they're making, and how much they're defending the artistic integrity of their film and what they're doing. And contrastly, on the other hand side of things, you have Muggeridge and the Bishop of Southwark kind of dashing off these kind of pre-prepared sounding lines about 10th rate movies, or you've got your 30 pieces of silver or whatever, and not really engaging with the issues that it raised. So it is a fascinating film, and there are, I know at least there's a scholar called Katie Turner who's got her own book on this subject coming out soon, specifically around costumes, and she's done a piece of Life of Brian saying that actually the costumes in Life of Brian and some of the sets are perhaps the most accurate of all the Jesus films, which is really interesting. And they do go to they have really done their research. They're not just kind of like dashing off a few easy cheap jokes. They do get a lot about the period, and that kind of for example, the environment of the different apocalyptic preachers all preaching their own kind of versions of what happens. That is. There's a lot in that. There's there was a lot of that around at the time, and the kind of the relationship between Rome and the Jews as well is kind of better. I mean, obviously it's comic, but you're in no doubt in that film, for example, that Rome is in charge, and that it's not, that Jesus is executed by the Romans. He's not, So it's both a very serious film and a very funny film. But
and the everydayness of crucifixion, take a cross first door on the left, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think that scene where you have basically a bunch of prophets and Brian inadvertently becomes one, in a space of 3 minutes, he kind of accidentally becomes a prophet, founds a religious movement, and they've already killed their first heretic within like 3 minutes. It's astonishing in that sense.
The economy of that scene is just brilliant, isn't it? That kind of passage is goes from that thing of him literally just dropping out of the sky, landing there, which is, I mean, is also an interesting, him dropping out of space into a role of a prophet is also an interesting comment, I think, on Christianity. And as you say, very swiftly, the kind of arguments build up, and people start taking on things that weren't on his radar at all, weren't his intention at all. But I mean, I guess that's what the film, it's one of the things the film is putting across, that these things have been added on top of the original things Jesus said, and become the things that people fight over.
So coming up to sort of the present day, I know that we're jumping over a lot, but I mean, people who are listening to this can buy your book.
That would be great.
and fill in any gaps that I've inadvertently left. But coming up to the present day, I'm very curious to sort of see the new Terrence Malick Way of the Wind, which sort of promises to be. I mean, we've had some Bible films. I guess we've had Last Days in the Desert, the Ewan McGregor version, and the Joaquin Phoenix Mary Magdalene, and then we also had the Old Testament, the Ridley Scott and the Darren Aronofsky's Noah, which sort of felt like there was going to be a new trend of sort of Old Testament kind of fantasy films. I got the feeling it was going towards a Lord of the Rings. That was the generic space it was attempting to fill.
Yeah, I mean I really like the Aronofsky film, actually. I feel I like it much more than the Ridley Scott one. I mean, partly it's it's a totally Jewish take on the story. It is, and that's one of the things that makes it so interesting. But it's also wedded in this idea. I think we can kind of, I'll come back to this again and again, really. But we're so familiar with these stories that we forget about how different they are and how odd they are in some ways. And Noah, I think, is the classic example, because Noah these days is the kind of the children's plaything, the kind of nice boat with all the different animals and all those kind of things. But in the the actual story is, I did a talk years ago called Biblical Horror Stories for Children about all these things in the Old Testament that are like the Noah story, are kind of mass acts of destruction or horrific violence.
Literally genocidal. I mean, it's a literally genocidal God in that. Yeah, well,
in several places that then get kind of like the unpalatable aspects get stripped away, and you kind of end up, before you know where you look, we've kind of got this thing of, well, here's Noah now is it's considered a children's story, and and when you think about it for a minute, it's not at all a children's story, and I think what's really good about that film is the kind of way Russell Crowe's character, who I think is, as his kind of star persona, is a bit unlikable. And he's it's a really interesting persona as a star, and particularly in that film. But he is kind of pursuing a logic within it, at the point where he's thinking of, killing his own grandchild, that he kind of thinks he is, there's a kind of religious zealotry there. He thinks he's doing what God wants him to do. He, sees that makes consistent sense, and he's not doing it because he is he thinks being a homicidal maniac is a good thing, but he doesn't realize, or perhaps he kind of sees this logic through, and that's and actually he ends up being this kind of Abraham figure that is wrestling about whether he should kill his own kin, and that's and I think without that you don't end up with that thing of the fact that the story as it is that everyone was wiped out except these 8 characters, and so partly because of that, and also partly the stuff with you mentioned Lord of the Rings. You've got these kind of like the kind of rock monsters at the start, and people hated the rock monsters. I actually kind of really like for 2 reasons. Partly because they've got the kind of Ray Harryhausen nod there in spades, but also because there is this passage just before the Noah story that comes in that does talk about these characters from heaven coming down and mating with the human women, and there being these, it's all this kind of stuff that, again, I think most Christians would not even kind of recognize as being part of the story, and yet it is part of the story, and we forget because those bits seem weird, they get kind of left out of it, and then we forget that they were there in the first place, and that often the Bible is a very the Bible is often a very weird book, and particularly Genesis, and Noah really gets that sense of, this is an odd book, and rather than kind of trying to present this kind of sanitized 21st century version, 21st century version of it, he kind of really leans into that weirdness, and is happy to kind of like to go with the darkness of it. It's I think it's a really interesting film.
And then, of course, goes even further with Mother. Which isn't strictly speaking kind of a biblical film in the sense that, but I mean, it's kind of
it's right there, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a parable as well. So it's it's doing that thing of forcing you to say, oh, that represents this and that represents that.
Yeah. I'm really interested as to what, I feel like something changes between those two films for Aronofsky. I think at the end of Noah, there's still this note of hope that, something, can be done, and that humanity is possibly savable and the planet is possibly savable. And it feels by the time Mother comes along that, that has maybe gone, and it is just the pessimism then of, we're not going to be able to pull this thing round, and we are all a bit doomed.
We're in a cycle which is doomed to repeat itself. And sort of, I was thinking of this recently because I recently rewatched A Serious Man, which to me is the Book of Job. It's like it's almost. I mean, obviously, it's updated and all the rest of it. But it just feels like the Book of Job, and that also makes me think of Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life as being, and it also just makes me think, which is something which your book has done, gargantuan effort just to make me think, but of how sort of like we do have these sort of religiously inspired filmmakers who might well be atheistic or I don't know what the Coen brothers would identify as, but there's very much that's in filmmaking. I mean, I think Terrence Malick, I've got a feeling he's a devout Christian, and that seems to come through his films almost from the very beginning.
I think I agree with you on that. But yeah, as you say, I mean, the Coens have made they've done, as you say, Serious Man, which is a kind of very much a Job thing, and obviously we've already talked about Hail Caesar, and there is this whole, there is this whole kind of question about God and morality that kind of seeps through their whole filmography, really. They are kind of fascinating filmmakers, and I think that is the case with a lot of the people that make the books, that make the films that I talk about in the book, that even if they're not even if they're not necessarily practicing Christians or very overt about it, that it still is something that they feel in them, and they kind of wrestle with that kind of stuff themselves, and it still is something that takes up a lot of their concerns and their headspace. And I think you see it in you see it in a lot of Rossellini's films, and you can kind of see across his life a kind of movement from a position of faith to a position of unbelief. And Scorsese as well.
Oh, of course, yeah. No, absolutely. And I recognise that he's a filmmaker we haven't actually talked about, and of course he made one of the most significant films of the '80s in terms of The Last Temptation of Christ. But I was to go back a second. I wonder if maybe maybe it's something to do with Jewish filmmakers as well, that some people like the Coens, there's more of a Jewish tradition of not necessarily having to be, performatively devout You can still, and you can even leave the religion, but you can still really think hard about the religion. And I guess in Christianity, you kind of don't have that as much, except perhaps maybe the lapsed Catholic is a sort of, you know, I mean, personally, my background is I come from a fairly, I wouldn't say strict, but a fairly heavy sort of Catholic background.
Right.
And I'm, which, you know, in true stereotypical fashion, I sort of renounced when I was in my teens.
Yeah.
But I think my atheism is very Catholic. It's a very Catholic atheism. And my interest in the Bible and in religion generally has never, if anything, it's kind of increased as my disbelief has sort of matured, you know, has been confirmed. But I just wonder if maybe Jewish filmmakers like the Coens find it, you know, find that there's they can go back to these stories as stories.
Yeah, I think that's very astute. I think that's probably true. You know, because they're very, you know, they're still a huge part of Jewish tradition and Jewish celebration, and you know, the kind of the I guess the kind of Jewish calendar really, which people celebrate whether, you know, whether or not you're necessarily believing it and practicing in it. And something like, I mean, one of the other films, I mean, we mentioned comedies ago. One of the more recent ones is a film called Sadomasochism by a Jewish filmmaker called Nina Paley, who is also a kind of Jewish atheist agnostic. And that's really, you know, that really kind of captures that, you know, that which you just talked about, that, you know, sense of connectedness to it, and the kind of the tradition coming down from her father and her father's father, of a kind of, skeptical sounds a bit too hard, but certainly a kind of questioning of the kind of grandfather questioning the traditional narrative, and then, you know, the father and the, you know, also kind of carrying some of those questions through to the granddaughter who is the filmmaker, that is, you know, that has kind of rejected the belief side of things, but is still very much involved in the kind of the idea of the family and the kind of the family celebrations and the traditions side of things as well. I mean, it's a kind of fascinating film from that point of view. And I think, you know, there are a number of I mean, you know, Spielberg is another interesting example. You know, in films from Close Encounters of the Third Kind through to, I think he was one of the producers on Prince of Egypt, and that you know, again, those kind of elements, you know, Close Encounters of the Third Kind reworks a lot of the Ten Commandments, for example, doesn't it? And it,
yeah, even E.T.
Well, yeah. I mean, E.T. is a classic Christ figure in a way.
And also a kind of wizened rabbi. Sort of when he has that white cloth over his head, it has a sort of rabbinic sort of appearance. God, I mean, this conversation could easily be as long as one of these Bible epics, because it's because there's so much to talk about. It's such a rich subject, and I guess sort of going back to the very beginning, so we can maybe to round this off. Maybe the reason we don't talk about these films is because we have a sort of there's a kind of politeness around religious faith in public discourse that we kind of like. We're sensitive of saying, you know, are you a practicing Christian, or are you, you know, because that's totally up to you, you know. But it kind of impoverishes the discourse if we're not sort of upfront about it, I feel.
I think it's kind of interesting, you know, that it is something we don't, you know, that doesn't necessarily get talked about so much, this collection of films, because they are, you know, I feel that it still feels to me like it's an important element of society, you know, and what's impacting things. And I guess, you know, people have been talking about living in a post-secular age ever since 9/11. And I think initially people saw that in terms of Islam, but I do think with the situation with Trump, that has kind of come round, and that there is now this, this radical group within it, that isn't, you wouldn't necessarily say it's mainstream, but it's certainly very significant in size, that is now, in this situation in America. And I think, one of the things I really feel about faith is that there's quite often a lot of debate about, does it improve society or does it make society worse? And I think it kind of does both. I think for some people, for some people, we've seen like religion has been abused and caused a lot of suffering to people on a huge extent that maybe wouldn't have happened if they weren't in a religious context. And at the same time, there's an awful lot that Christians have done and that have taken some of the teachings of Jesus more literally, and people of other faiths as well, and from drawing on their own traditions, that have that have really enriched societies. And huge amounts of kind of charities and all those kind of things set up by people that were basically feeling challenged by those texts. And some atheists would say, well, I don't need religion to make me a better person, and I believe that's definitely true in a lot of cases. In many cases, but I think for some people that is a factor, and the fact that they that they believe in something bigger than themselves does inspire them to do good stuff. And so when you've got this kind of chasm of, on the one hand, you've got religion can inspire people to be better and to make the world a better place, and on the other side you've got this thing of religion can make people worse and can be part of the tool that causes something like the storming the Capitol, for example. Why would we not want to be taking part in that discussion and trying to move the needle in the way that is going to make the world better, even if even people that aren't that don't have their own faith anymore, don't have their own belief anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really a great sentiment to sort of draw to a close. But before we finish, I obviously have to ask you what film book you would recommend to our listener.
This may well have been done before, but I guess continuing the 100 theme, I love Ebert's 100 Greatest Films, or the 100 Great. I can't remember the exact title now.
Do you know what? I don't think anybody has chosen that up until now. I don't think that's the first.
Oh, it's marvelous. It was one of the. The book is my book is a part of a series of that the BFI has done with 100 American horror films and 100 westerns and 100 Bollywood films and so on. So that was a big part of the reason I wanted to do it in that format. But also, I love Ebert's writings, and there's films I know I've watched because I know that even if I don't enjoy the film, I'll enjoy hearing him writing about it afterwards. And just his his kind of turn of phrase and his kind of ability to draw you into a story. I think is amazing. So
You've got an amazing turn of phrase as well, Matt. There was a phrase that absolutely, as a writer, I read it and went, "Oh, damn, that's too good." It was about those first talkies. We talked about it earlier, the Michael Curtiz Noah's Ark. And you say the patter of these first talkies before the sort of deluge is going to come, and it was just sort of like, oh, I see what you're doing, Noah's Ark, the rain, but just that the description of the patter of those first few sort of semi-talky films before the real sort of before the flood came, Yeah. It's so apt in terms of describing Noah.
Oh, thank you. I did. Yeah, was quite pleased when I wrote that
one. Yeah, nobody writes that accidentally. That's no. Superb. Okay, so absolute. So thanks so much, Matt, for.
That's all right. I've really enjoyed it.
So that was my conversation with the appropriately named Matthew Page. We went through a heck of a lot of films in a very short period of time, and I think we dealt with, that's going to be one of the weightiest discussions we've had on Writers on Film. We really went into some stuff, but yeah, I found it really, really interesting. I hope you did too. His book 100 Bible Films is released later this month, later in May, depending on when this episode is out. And all that remains is for me to thank Elliot Atkins for the music, Ali Howard for the artwork, and thank you, the listener, for listening. Until next week, please take care.
$1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.